Sarah's car hummed softly as she drove through the narrow, winding roads leading to Pluckley. The village, with its reputation as one of England's most haunted, had always intrigued her. Now, as she approached her new home, she felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. The landscape around her was picturesque, with rolling hills and lush green fields, yet an eerie mist clung to the ground, hinting at the village's darker stories. As she entered the village, Sarah noticed the old stone cottages, their windows darkened and quiet, giving the place a timeless quality. She pulled up to her new residence, a quaint cottage with ivy-covered walls. As she unpacked, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though she dismissed it as nerves. The next day, Sarah started her job at the local primary school. The children were friendly, though some seemed unnaturally subdued. During recess, she overheard hushed conversations about the ghost children and the forbidden woods, piquing her curiosity. That evening, she dined at the village pub, the Black Horse. The atmosphere was cozy, yet conversations stopped when she entered, and the villagers eyed her with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. An elderly man approached her. "New in town, are you?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Yes, just moved in," Sarah replied with a smile. "Name's George. Watch yourself, lass. This village has secrets best left alone," he said, his eyes glinting with something she couldn't quite place. As Sarah returned home, the fog had thickened, enveloping the village in a ghostly shroud. She felt a chill, not just from the cold, but from the palpable sense of history and mystery that seemed to seep from the very stones of the place. It was a village steeped in tales of the supernatural, and Sarah, intrigued by the unknown, was eager to uncover the truth behind the whispers that filled the air. The following week, Sarah settled into her routine at the school. The children were lively, though she couldn't help but notice their tendency to avoid certain topics, especially those involving the village's history. One afternoon, while organizing supplies in the school's attic, Sarah stumbled upon an old, dust-covered diary. Its pages were yellowed with age, filled with neat, spidery handwriting. Curiosity piqued, she sat down and began to read. The diary belonged to a former teacher named Elizabeth, who had worked at the school decades ago. The entries detailed strange occurrences, children claiming to see ghosts, disappearing toys, and whispers echoing through the halls. Sarah was particularly struck by repeated mentions of the silent children and forbidden woods. As she read, the temperature in the attic seemed to drop. Sarah felt a sudden chill, her breath visible in the cold air. She glanced around, half expecting to see something, but the attic was empty. Dismissing the sensation as a draft, she closed the diary and decided to take it home for further reading. That night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows seemed to dance in the corners of her vision, and the usual creaks and groans of the old house sounded unnaturally loud. As she settled into bed, she heard faint whispers, almost childlike, coming from the attic. Heart pounding, she told herself it was just her imagination, a trick of her mind spurred by the eerie stories in the diary. The next morning, Sarah mentioned her discovery to a colleague, Tom, who had lived in the village all his life. Tom's expression darkened. "You shouldn't be reading that diary," he warned. "It's full of old superstitions and nonsense." "But there seems to be something real behind these stories," Sarah insisted. "The children, they mentioned seeing ghosts." Tom sighed, looking around as if to ensure no one was listening. "Look, Pluckley has its share of ghost stories. Some say they're true, others don't. But it's best not to stir up the past. Some things are better left buried." Despite Tom's warning, Sarah's curiosity only grew. She couldn't ignore the diary's vivid descriptions or the eerie experiences she'd already had. Determined to learn more, she resolved to investigate further, unaware that her search for the truth would soon lead her down a path fraught with danger and unsettling revelations. Intrigued and undeterred, Sarah spent her evenings poring over the diary. Elizabeth, the former teacher, had meticulously documented the strange occurrences in the school and the village, describing ghostly figures, whispers, and inexplicable cold spots. But the most disturbing entries detailed the mysterious disappearances of several children, all of whom were never found. The village had hushed up the incidents, attributing them to accidents or runaways, but Elizabeth believed something more sinister was at play. Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah visited the local library, hoping to find more records about the village's past. The librarian, Mrs. Green, was an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a penchant for gossip. She seemed hesitant when Sarah inquired about the missing children, but eventually, she relented, pointing Sarah to a dusty archive of old newspapers and records. As Sarah sifted through the brittle pages, she found scant mentions of the disappearances, often buried under more mundane village news. However, the few articles she did find were troubling. They hinted at a series of investigations that led nowhere and families left devastated and unanswered. Each disappearance was linked by vague allusions to the Forbidden Woods, a place Sarah had seen referenced in the diary. On her way home, Sarah decided to visit Mrs. White, an elderly villager known for her knowledge of Pluckley's history. Mrs. White lived in a small, neatly kept cottage on the outskirts of the village. The old woman welcomed Sarah warmly, offering her tea and biscuits as they sat in a cozy parlor filled with antique furniture and fading photographs. When Sarah mentioned the diary and the missing children, Mrs. White's expression darkened. She spoke in a low, trembling voice, as if recalling a terrible memory. "They were such sweet children," she murmured. "No one wanted to believe what happened to them. The village tried to forget, to move on, but some things you can't forget." "What really happened to them?" Sarah asked gently. Mrs. White hesitated, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "There are old stories, legends really, about the woods. They say it's a place where lost souls wander, where spirits linger. Some believe the children wandered in and never came out. Others think—" She trailed off, eyes glistening with unshed tears. Sarah pressed gently, sensing that Mrs. White knew more than she was saying. But the old woman shook her head. "I've said too much. The past should stay buried, dear. Digging it up will only bring heartache." Despite Mrs. White's warning, Sarah's resolve hardened. The stories were more than just legends. They were the key to understanding the village's dark history. As she left the cottage, Sarah knew she had to continue her search, even if it meant uncovering truths the village preferred to keep hidden. As Sarah continued her investigation, she encountered increasing resistance from the villagers. Her questions about the missing children and the diary were met with suspicion and cold stares. At the school, her colleagues subtly distanced themselves, and parents began whispering about her in hushed tones. The once welcoming village seemed to turn against her, as if guarding a dark secret. Undeterred, Sarah sought out Tom again, hoping to learn more about the forbidden woods mentioned in the diary and by Mrs. White. Tom was reluctant to speak, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a wary caution. "Sarah, you're stirring up old ghosts. The woods, they've always been a place of superstition and fear. People say strange things happen there, but it's just stories." "But the children," Sarah began, but Tom cut her off. "The children were lost," he said firmly. "The woods are dangerous, especially for kids. It's a tragedy, but looking into it won't change anything. Sometimes it's best to let the past rest." Frustrated by the lack of concrete answers and the villagers' reluctance, Sarah decided to explore the woods herself. She packed a small bag with a flashlight, a notebook, and the diary, setting out one foggy morning. The woods loomed dark and foreboding on the edge of the village, the trees twisted and gnarled as if bearing witness to centuries of secrets. As Sarah ventured deeper, the dense canopy blocked out much of the daylight, casting the forest in a perpetual twilight. The air grew colder, and the silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Despite her resolve, a sense of unease settled over her, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and a chill ran down Sarah's spine. She heard faint, distant whispers, like children calling out. Heart pounding, she turned on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the mist. The light caught something, movement, just at the edge of her vision. She followed it, only to find nothing but the shadows of trees. As she stood there, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to be pleading, calling for help. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the diary, flipping to a page where Elizabeth had described similar experiences. The connection was undeniable. The children were trying to communicate, to tell their story. Shaken but determined, Sarah decided to return to the village, her mind racing with questions. She felt more certain than ever that the children's spirits were real, trapped and seeking closure. However, her actions had not gone unnoticed. That evening, she found a note slipped under her door, written in a shaky hand. "Leave it alone. For your own good." The warning only fueled Sarah's determination. She knew she was close to uncovering the truth, and despite the dangers, she couldn't turn back now. The silent children deserved to have their story told, and she was determined to be the one to tell it. Sarah spent the next few days combing through the village records and old newspapers, piecing together the fragmented history of the disappearances. The stories were distressingly similar. Children vanished without a trace, often last seen playing near the woods. The official explanations varied: accidents, kidnappings, runaways, but none felt satisfactory, especially given the eerie parallels to the accounts in Elizabeth's diary. One evening, as Sarah reviewed her notes, Tom knocked on her door. His face was pale, eyes downcast. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice heavy with resignation. He explained that his family had lived in Pluckley for generations, and that his ancestors had been involved in the investigations, or rather, the cover-ups, of the children's disappearances. "My great-grandfather was one of the village elders," Tom confessed. "They found something in the woods, something they didn't want to believe. There were old bones and signs of rituals. The elders decided it was better for everyone if the truth was buried along with the bodies." "Rituals?" Sarah echoed, horrified. "What kind of rituals?" "Nobody knows for sure," Tom admitted. "There are rumors, but nothing concrete. The village elders thought it was some kind of pagan worship or cult activity. They hushed it all up to protect the village's reputation." The revelation left Sarah shaken. The idea that the village had concealed such a horrific truth was both shocking and heartbreaking. She thanked Tom for his honesty, but as he left, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the knowledge he had shared. The next day, Sarah sought out Mrs. White again. The old woman welcomed her cautiously, sensing Sarah's urgency. As they spoke, Mrs. White revealed more about the village's history, reluctantly confirming Tom's account. She explained that the woods had long been considered cursed, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. "They say the children wandered in and were lost forever," Mrs. White said, tears in her eyes. "But some of us believe they were taken, sacrificed in some twisted ritual to appease whatever haunts those woods." Sarah's resolve hardened. The children had been victims, not just of tragic accidents, but of a community willing to bury its darkest secrets. She knew she had to bring the truth to light, to give the lost children a voice and, perhaps, a chance for peace. But she also understood the risks. Revealing the truth could tear the village apart and put her at odds with powerful forces. Despite the danger, Sarah decided to organize a public memorial for the lost children, a gathering where the village could confront its past. She hoped it would be a step toward healing, both for the community and the restless spirits. However, she knew it would also expose her to further hostility and potentially supernatural retribution. As Sarah made her preparations, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, the whispers in her house growing more insistent. The children's voices, once plaintive, now sounded urgent, as if warning her of something terrible yet to come. She steeled herself for the memorial, determined to see her mission through, whatever the cost. The day of the memorial arrived, shrouded in a heavy, oppressive fog that seemed to seep into the village from the surrounding woods. Despite the tension in the air, a small crowd gathered in the village square, drawn by curiosity, guilt, or a sense of duty. Sarah stood at the center, her heart pounding as she prepared to speak. She began by recounting the history she had uncovered, sharing the stories of the missing children and the village's long-standing practice of burying these tragedies in silence. As she spoke, she could see the villagers' reactions. Some were visibly moved, while others looked angry or fearful. Tom stood by her side, a silent support, while Mrs. White watched from the edge of the crowd, her face a mask of resignation. As Sarah continued, she felt a strange stillness settle over the square. The air grew colder, and she saw her breath misting in the chill. The villagers murmured uneasily, some looking around as if expecting something to happen. And then it did. A low, keening wail filled the air, rising and falling like a mournful chorus. The sound was eerie, otherworldly, and as it grew louder, the villagers recoiled in fear. Sarah looked around, her eyes wide, and saw the ghostly figures of children materializing at the edge of the square. They were faint, translucent, their expressions a mix of sorrow and yearning. The crowd gasped, and some began to back away, but Sarah stood her ground. She realized that the children had come to witness the village's acknowledgement of their fate, to see if the truth would finally be spoken aloud. Gathering her courage, Sarah addressed the spirits directly. "We are here to remember you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "To acknowledge the wrongs that were done and to seek your forgiveness. You deserve to be heard, to be remembered." As she spoke, the children's faces seemed to soften, their forms becoming more distinct. The wailing subsided, replaced by a profound silence. The villagers stood transfixed, witnessing a moment that was both surreal and deeply poignant. But then, as if responding to the release of pent-up emotions, the sky darkened ominously, and a fierce wind swept through the square. The villagers huddled together, and the ghostly figures began to fade, their expressions lingering with a mix of sadness and relief. The storm that followed was sudden and violent, the wind howling through the village like a banshee's wail. The crowd scattered, seeking shelter, as rain poured down in sheets, drenching the square. Sarah and Tom stood their ground, drenched but resolute. The storm seemed to rage against the very act of remembrance, as if the forces that had kept the past buried were resisting their unearthing. As the rain continued to fall, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Mrs. White, her eyes filled with tears. "You've done what needed to be done," Mrs. White said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Now we must weather the consequences." The storm raged on, but Sarah knew they had taken the first crucial step. The truth was out, the village had acknowledged its past, and the silent children had been given a voice. Now, it was up to the community to decide how to move forward, whether to heal or to continue living under the shadow of the past. As the storm began to subside, the villagers emerged from their shelters, looking shaken and subdued. The ghostly figures had vanished, leaving only a lingering sense of unease. Sarah felt a mix of relief and uncertainty, knowing that while the memorial had been a necessary step, it was far from the end of the journey. There were still questions to be answered, wounds to be healed, and truths to be fully faced. As the storm cleared, the villagers gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of what they had witnessed. Sarah felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but there was a sense of relief too, a feeling that they had finally acknowledged a part of their history that had been buried for too long. In the aftermath of the memorial, the village was quiet, as if holding its breath. Sarah spent the following days reflecting on the events, deeply moved by the ghostly children's appearance and the villagers' reactions. She hoped that this was the beginning of healing, but she knew that some wounds might never fully heal. One evening, as she prepared to leave her cottage for a walk, Mrs. White appeared at her door, looking more frail than ever. "I need to talk to you," she said softly. They sat together in the dimly lit kitchen, the weight of the past hanging heavy between them. Mrs. White spoke of her own family's involvement in the events, revealing that her father had been one of the elders who had decided to cover up the children's disappearances. "He thought he was protecting us, protecting the village," she said, tears in her eyes. "But in doing so, he condemned us all to live in fear and guilt." Sarah listened, her heart aching for the pain in Mrs. White's voice. The old woman seemed relieved to finally share her burden, to bring the truth into the light. They talked late into the night, discussing the possibility of exhuming the remains found in the woods and giving the children a proper burial. "We need to lay them to rest," Mrs. White insisted. "It's the only way the village can move forward." The next day, Sarah and a few villagers, including Tom and Mrs. White, gathered in the woods. With the help of authorities, they carefully excavated the site where the bones had been found. The atmosphere was somber, the air thick with the scent of earth and the weight of history. As the remains were unearthed, a sense of quiet reverence settled over the group. The villagers, once divided, now stood together, united in their desire to honor the lost children. A simple but heartfelt ceremony was held, with prayers and moments of silence, acknowledging the lives that had been taken too soon. After the ceremony, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace. The village, though still haunted by its past, had taken a significant step toward healing. The spirits of the children seemed to have been laid to rest, their restless cries replaced by a calm silence. Mrs. White approached Sarah, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've done a great service for us all," she said. "The children can rest now, and so can we." Sarah nodded, feeling a deep sense of closure. But she also knew that this was not the end of her journey. The letters she had received, hinting at similar mysteries in other towns, lingered in her mind. There were more stories to uncover, more truths to bring to light. As Sarah walked back to her cottage, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The village of Pluckley had taught her the power of truth and the importance of facing the past, no matter how painful. It was a lesson she intended to carry with her, wherever her path might lead next. In the days following the memorial and the burial ceremony, Pluckley began to change. The villagers, once reticent and guarded, started to open up about their own experiences and memories, sharing stories that had been hidden away for too long. The village square, once a place of whispered fears, became a space for healing and reflection. Sarah noticed these changes as she walked through the village, preparing for her departure. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that her efforts had helped the village confront its past and begin to heal. However, she also knew that her time in Pluckley had come to an end. There were other places and stories waiting to be uncovered, and she felt compelled to continue her journey. As she packed her belongings, Sarah received a final visit from Tom and Mrs. White. They expressed their gratitude, not just for her uncovering the truth, but for bringing the community together in a way they had never imagined. Mrs. White handed Sarah a small, worn book, a collection of local legends and stories, including those of the children. "Take this with you," she said. "It belongs to someone who understands the importance of these stories." Touched by the gesture, Sarah thanked them both. As they said their goodbyes, she felt a mixture of sadness and anticipation. The village had been her home, if only briefly, and she had grown to care deeply for its people and history. But the call of the unknown, of new mysteries to explore, was strong. On her last evening in Pluckley, Sarah took a final walk through the woods, where the fog hung thick and silent. She paused by the clearing where the children's remains had been found, feeling a sense of calm and closure. The woods, once filled with a sense of dread, now seemed peaceful, as if the spirits of the children had finally found rest. As she turned to leave, Sarah felt a gentle breeze brush past her, carrying with it the faint sound of children's laughter. She smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace, and knew that the village would be all right. The next morning, Sarah set off, leaving the village behind. As she drove away, she glanced back at the misty silhouette of Pluckley, a place that had changed her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. She thought of the letters she had received, and the possibility of new adventures and discoveries. With a sense of purpose and hope, Sarah looked forward to the future. There were more stories out there, more truths to uncover, and she felt ready to face whatever came her way. As she drove into the horizon, the weight of the past lifted, leaving her free to embrace whatever lay ahead. If you enjoyed unraveling this, you're in for another spine-tingling tale. Click the video on your screen to discover more eerie stories from the Phantom Story Society, where history's darkest secrets come to life. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Until next time, stay curious and beware of the shadows.